Hi, this is Chuck Braverman, and I'm the moderator for Westdoc Online, and this is episode number 40, despite what you might hear in a few minutes. This is a little add-on that we are putting onto this episode to introduce you to our new sponsor, which is Backblaze. I've used Backblaze on my computers for years. I replaced another software which I didn't think was working as well, and Backblaze has served me well. It works on a Mac or a PC. It gives you unlimited backup for your Mac or PC. It's only $6 a month. If you click on the link at the bottom of every page on westdoconline.com, you'll get a 15-day free offer. I strongly recommend it. And now here is the trailer for our upcoming conversation with director Matt Tyrnauer, the trailer for Where's My Roy Cohn. Thank you.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Last question today. What makes Roy Cohn tick?
Dora Cohn wanted a different son from the son that God gave her. And that imbued him a sense of shame about who he was. His father gave him the language through law and politics to express his shame.
Roy Cohn's contempt for people, his contempt for the law, was so evident on his face that you knew you were in the presence of evil.
He was like a caged animal. If you opened the door, he would come out and get you.
He's this bridge between the legitimate and the illegitimate world.
When John Gotti walked into a bar and shot a guy in the head, Roy managed to get Gotti off.
We have Cohn investigating homosexuals very aggressively.
But he was the one who threw the good parties.
And there were rumors he was picking up male prostitutes.
He could pull strings and bring people together. He could pull strings and make people do things.
I was in his office when Nancy Reagan called and thanked him for getting her husband elected.
Cohn looked at Donald Trump as a protege.
Donald had the money, and Roy had the balls and the shrewdness.
Attack. Don't settle. Don't apologize. Attack.
When you look at Cohn's life, you're shining a light on demagoguery, hypocrisy, and the darkest parts of the American psyche.
According to Roy was responsible for everything important that happened in the United States.
Hi, this is Chuck Braverman. This is Westdoc, episode number 39, and that was pretty amazing, the trailer that we just saw. And so we have the filmmaker here today to discuss the making of the film. And before we get to that, I would just like to remind you that in part this is being brought to you by RealScreen.com, and RealScreen is an online and print magazine, and they do the Real Screen Summit every year, twice a year. Next one up is in January 27th to the 30th in New Orleans. Go to summit.realscreen.com to register. I highly recommend it if you're in the film, reality, or documentary business. And now it is my pleasure to present a filmmaker who has actually done some remarkable films, which we're going to talk about, the latest being maybe the most remarkable and the most timely, about a man who's been gone for a number of years, but it seems like he's still around. Roy Cohn. The filmmaker is Matt Tyrnauer, and let's say hi to Matt. Hi, Matt. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. Where are you speaking from? Are you here in the LA area?
Yeah, I'm in Los Angeles, specifically Atwater Village, and that's where my production company is based.
Atwater Village, I think, is that sort of in the area of Dodger Stadium?
Close. It's kind of the area around the LA River between Silver Lake and Glendale.
Which is
sort of like a buffer zone of that part of town.
Right. Well, when I grew up in LA, it was an area that we kind of stayed away from, and now it's like the hip, hot venue, and one of my grown children lives in that area, and His friend has a restaurant there right on the river, which has been successful from day one. And there you are. So, Matt, I've seen this film. It's really sort of shocking and amazing and extremely well done, very artfully. I'm curious as to how you got into the film business in the first place, and a little bit of your background and how you got to this place.
Sure. Well, my career started in journalism at Vanity Fair magazine. I started there when I was 22 years old. I had written for Spy magazine as really an intern, and then followed Graydon Carter to the New York Observer. And then he, after 9 months at the Observer, was hired to be the editor of Vanity Fair, and he brought me with him. So I'd already been writing features. So by 22, 23, I was a full-fledged writer for Vanity Fair, which was very much a matter of being in the right place at the right time. And wrote long-form features for the magazine for years. However, my background really was film in my education. So I always had the idea that I would want to make films. I had this very time-consuming, great gig at Vanity Fair. Eventually, I decided to make a movie, a documentary, and that was the film Valentino, the Last Emperor, which was my first film. And people often ask me how I got into it and how I sort of arranged switching careers. And the answer is I just did it. It was a risky thing to do. Making any independent film is always a certain amount of risk. And I thought that this was a good idea, and I pursued it. And luckily it came out okay. But there's no reward without risk, I suppose, that adage. And this turned out to be one that was the right type of risk for me. And I launched my career as a filmmaker. And now I'm doing it full time.
So you say that your background was really in film. Did you go to film school somewhere or study film?
Well, I had a liberal arts education at Wesleyan University in glamorous Middletown, Connecticut. And but I really studied film. I was a film major, and that was my real love. So I studied film as a liberal arts discipline, and Wesleyan has a great film program, in fact.
So there was a great piece in the New York Times a couple of days ago that by Maureen Dowd, which I just reread, and I can't remember her ever interviewing a filmmaker, certainly not a documentary filmmaker before. So what an incredible honor. And she wrote a great piece about you. As a matter of fact, maybe I'll put a link to it in the show notes here on the website. And it said that you, at one point, I think when you were doing Studio 54, that you thought about doing Roy Cohn, and then you said, no, that's a silly idea. You want to tell us that story and how that happened?
Right, very much so. So the film that came out previous to this was Studio 54, which is, just like it sounds, a deep dive into the story of what people call the greatest disco of all time. I really focused on the second part of that story, which is not sex, drugs, and disco. It's really Law and Order, actually. It's about the demise of the disco and the two guys behind it who ended up going to prison, and also the end of a certain time in New York and the United States, which is that transition between the kind of psychedelic freedom of the 70s and the more treacherous and politically conservative 80s. It's also a movie very much about the HIV/AIDS crisis, which was coincident with the end of Studio 54. Back to your question, Roy Cohn was very much a character in the Studio 54 world. He was the attorney for Ian Schrager and Steve Rubell, who were the proprietors of the club, and he was the kind of greatest fixer and power broker of New York in that period, what we call mid-century. So I'm watching all the archival for that film, Studio 54, and Roy Cohn was a big part of it. And I kept on sitting in the edit room saying to myself, well, this is a great character, Roy Cohn. And no one's really done a documentary about him. And I kept putting it out of my mind saying, well, it's really not worth pursuing because the connection to Donald Trump would really be the reason to make a Roy Cohn movie right now. And to get into a little bit, Trump was the protege of Roy Cohn. So this was something I knew. And as I'm seeing this incredible rich trove of archival, I thought, well, great movie. But won't be relevant because Trump will lose the election. He was polling at a kind of impossibly low level at that point, and all through 2016. I looked at the New York Times tracking poll every day, which gave him something like a 9% chance of winning the Electoral College, and I believed it, as did most people, it seems. Anyway, the day of the election, the night of the election, after he won the Electoral College, I wrote the treatment for this film because I realized that the story of Roy Cohn and his creation of Trump led directly to the national nightmare of the present time. And I think it's fair to say that Roy Cohn invented or created a president from beyond the grave, which I think is a first.
And you actually spent time, though, with Trump in your past for Vanity Fair, at Mar-a-Lago.
Yeah.
So,
it came out in the New York Times piece that you referred to earlier that Maureen Dowd wrote. I think it was might have been my very first Vanity Fair assignment. If not, it was almost. So at 22 years old, I was dispatched to Mar-a-Lago, which he had recently acquired and had not done anything with, because this was a time when he was not flush. He had been in bankruptcy or near bankruptcy, and he had this kind of white elephant property in Palm Beach. And the daughter, Tiffany, was born, and this was right after the kind of tabloid explosion of the Marla Maples affair and the divorce from Ivana Trump, which was really a big story in New York at the time, the type of thing that Vanity Fair would have covered, but not in a truly serious way. I mean, we have to remember that Trump was a joke. As David Remnick put it in the New Yorker in a really great piece, he was part of the New York jokescape, and no one took him seriously. So I was, as the junior reporter, sent down to write kind of a trifling little piece about Donald Trump, Mar-a-Lago, and the birth of Tiffany Trump. Tiffany Trump's namesake is the store Tiffany, because at the time Trump was getting a lot of mileage out of his tabloid line that when he acquired the air rights from Tiffany to build Trump Tower, because Tiffany and Company is right next to Trump Tower. They share a block on Fifth Avenue. He vowed that he would name his next child Tiffany, and he did. But that child was not with his wife of many years, Ivana Trump. It was with his mistress, Marla Maples. They weren't married at the time, but they were cohabitating and spending the winter in part in Palm Beach. So I went down and spent a couple days with him. And it was a surreal experience. But even if he hadn't been elected president, it would have been unforgettable just because of the antics he was up to, which were designed more than likely to impress me because I was there with a reporter's notebook, and Trump has always been adept at creating good copy, and this was Vanity Fair was a big platform for him at the time, actually.
Getting back to Roy, who I guess in a way was kind of a mentor for Trump. How did you start attacking the film? What was your process? Because it's very, very well put together and very nicely structured. But I'm just curious as to, with so much stuff, where did you start? And did you go back to your outline, or did you pivot, or what happened?
It's a good question. I think I don't go back to my outline generally. I always think that when you write a treatment for a documentary, it serves a couple purposes. One is to raise money and to impress people who may be interested in the subject and to show them what your thinking is. And the other is to kind of gather your thoughts and put them down on paper. But then as you begin the creative process, it really takes a life of its own. And, these films are not scripted, which is the brilliance of documentaries, that they're scripted in reverse, really. They're reportorial, so you generally, for feature films, you go and you do reporting on and off camera, and then you gather your material and you put the piece together, generally on the wall of the edit room on index cards. The system I use, color-coded index cards. And that's where the story takes shape. So you find out things about your project in the middle of it, and you kind of go down roads, and sometimes you reach dead ends, sometimes you find things that change the course of the project itself. I had an idea of what I wanted to do, certainly, and I keep revising it in my head, and sometimes I make notes about what I'm up to. And starting out as a writer and then becoming a filmmaker, there's a huge difference in those processes, actually. Filmmaking involves a great deal of writing, even documentary filmmaking does. But writing a book or a long article is a very lonely process. It's a really lonely work. Writing or making a film is a utterly collaborative process, and it's for me, a very joyful one. I love the process of collaboration. So a lot of the shape of the documentary comes out in the dialogue that you're having with your creative collaborators, and that could be anyone from the producer to the cameraman to the film cutter, to the person who's your assistant or the intern. I mean, everyone is in on it, and that's really, I think, the best part. And I've been so happy in this collaborative work of the past years.
Let's take a look at another short clip here, and then we'll comment on it.
There was a confidence about him that was unshakable.
He managed to get out of legal difficulties in ways that almost no other lawyer could have. He was a legal magician. In his own trial involving the Fifth Avenue Coach Company, his lawyer had a heart attack. Roy got up and delivered his own defense. 7 hours of his own defense without looking at a note.
Cohn kept appealing to patriotism. He said, "I love the United States of America, and I can't believe that most of the people in this great country think that I could ever commit a criminal act." He's just lying to save his skin. It had a tremendous impact on the jury. The foreman of the jury came back the next day wearing an American flag in his lapel, and he was acquitted. I mean, he was really the Teflon fraud.
Music is very dramatic too, but works, and I didn't realize when I was watching it, if a film is really working, you get drawn in, and as a filmmaker, sometimes you start looking at the lighting or the camera positions, and then you're kind of in trouble. But here, I realize now, looking back at this clip, that who did the music, and how did you come to that choice?
Yeah, it's mostly score, and it's composed by a really wonderful person that does film scores. Lauren Balfe is his name, and he's based in London and Los Angeles. I've worked with him on 2 films now, and I'm eager to do another one with him. I think he's very talented. We have a great kind of shorthand. I try to, whenever possible, to have an orchestra record the score as well, rather than doing what's called the synth score. So it's composed on synth, and then we get an orchestra, usually in Europe, and he conducts it. I use very little source music or needle drop in this. The one thing I did use is Ravel's Bolero as a kind of mood setter, and it's also the closing credits song. There are two pieces in the closing credits, and Bolero had a kind of haunting effect to it, sort of a spookiness and the creepy, kind of creepy feeling to it, the way we sort of cut it over this montage of Roy Cohn reaching the apex of his power in New York City in the 70s.
How much can you tell us about the financing and how easy or difficult it was? And as soon as you say orchestra and scoring and everything else, obviously there's a few bucks spent on the making of this film. So I'm curious as to if it was a circuitous path or whether, it was just a slam dunk.
Well, slam dunk, I think, implies that someone wrote one check and we just went and made the movie, which is, in this case, wasn't what happened. I've made movies of every type now in terms of financing. The truly independent film, which this is actually, which was made with private equity that was raised by the producers, allows you an enormous amount of creative freedom. It allows you the most creative freedom generally, and I cherish that. It also creates more work for the producers as you have to raise the money frequently as you're going along. So it's a dangerous way to do it at times, because if you run out of money, then you have to slow down or sometimes stop, and that creates a lot of problems because you lose some collaborators if you need to kind of switch them off the project. Or a lot of treacherous things can happen if you run out of money. In this case, with this film, we didn't. It was an idea, as I said, that I had right after Trump won. I made the calls to networks and producers who would finance, and I didn't get immediate yeses, so I stopped pursuing that actually in this case, and I started to raise the money through private equity channels and relationships I had with people who finance film. We got some seed money from some really wonderful people who became producers on the film. Then we, using the network of some of the original financiers, we asked people in the New York liberal power structure to come in and finance. And this is where we were surprised. In the early days of Trump, we found there was a lot of trepidation among people who have deep pockets in that world. It wasn't really ever said explicitly, but it seemed to us that they thought it was too dangerous to put their name on a movie that would be so explicitly anti-Trump and be a kind of expose about the type of politics that led to the rise of what we now unfortunately know as Trumpism. This was a chilling moment for me, because what that indicates is that there was a kind of self-selecting McCarthyism, for lack of a better term, or maybe that's the perfect term in this case, at play. Because part of the danger of paranoid politics and witch hunt politics and what is called McCarthyism is that people self-censor. And it creates a culture of fear and paranoia that curbs freedom of speech. It doesn't have to be someone actively going out and silencing people. It can be a chilling effect that ripples through society. And that was happening clearly. I'm sure it's continuing to happen. We see examples of it in the media and in other places every day. It doesn't seem to be as severe as the 1950s at this point, but it's definitely a frightening moment for that, and this was a good example of it. Long story short, we engaged with Sundance in a really extraordinary program they have called Catalyst, where directors are put together with financiers for a weekend at Sundance in Utah. and we managed to raise most of the budget in the course of that. Lynn Lear, who, along with Norman Lear, were enormously supportive of this project early on, were key financiers, and we're very grateful to them. Their politics are impeccable, in my opinion.
Well, it's a fascinating story, and especially talking about self-censorship, because I think it's happening quite a bit. And the problem with it is it's like glaucoma. You know, you don't know that you have it until it's too late. In a way, you know, a strange comparison, but I mean,
no, I think it's apt. You know, the other metaphor that frequently is deployed these days is the boiling of the frog. You know, you don't know if you're the frog that you're being boiled to death if it happens slowly. And this experiment, you know, this experiment has become a metaphor. And the good news is that we got the movie made, so we triumphed over what, at that time, when we were actively trying to finance the movie, was a kind of freezing over of people who otherwise would be, at least on paper, willing to be part of the resistance. This movie is a part of that, what we call the resistance. And it's a sort of diaspora, I think, at this point, but this was meant to be a contribution to that.
So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't Sony the theatrical distributor of the film, or not?
Sony Pictures Classics, yes.
Right. And so does that indicate, or I should say, what does that indicate in terms of post-theatrical life? Do you have a deal, can you say, with, you know, one of the streamers or somebody? Or are you looking for a deal, or what's the story there?
Well, the movie went to Sundance in January, and Sony Pictures Classics acquired it at Sundance, which I was thrilled about. And it's coming out in Los Angeles and New York on September 20th, and then it goes across the country throughout the fall to many theaters. So this is for a documentary. It's called the Specialty Film Division, and it's a wide release in that context. After theatrical, it will be streaming, and really in North America, Sony Classics has it all covered. So it'll stream on platforms that they have deals with, and I believe in the case of this, it's on Stars, which is for cable, and I believe they have a streaming service as well. Generally, things like this go onto iTunes, and they find their way into Amazon and other streaming platforms like that. So it'll be very readily available.
So when you sold it, again, I think most of the audience here are filmmakers or people that are really interested in film. And, you know, if you don't want to answer, don't answer. But when Sony Classic Pictures picked it up, Sony Pictures Classic, were you covered at that point in time as to whatever budget was, or were you still underwater?
They're a major player. In my opinion, they're the gold standard of independent film. They really were inventors of the genre, and they're really the major player in that kind of theatrical, gold-plated release market. They were a municipal. Did I say that correctly? No, I mispronounced it. They were. It was a good deal for us. Let's put it that way.
Okay, and the reason I'm only pressing on it is because we all know that, with the exception of some films that really break through in the documentary world, that it's hard to make a living in the theatrical end. I mean, the only way to make a living is by selling it to, you know, Netflix or Amazon or HBO or Showtime, right?
Yes and no. I think you can do very well in a number of ways. I don't think anyone's in the independent film business for motives other than creating the greatest work possible, because there are ways to make tons of money that don't necessarily add to society. You could figure out how to be in banking or real estate or something like that, and probably make a lot more money faster.
I don't mean making tons of money. I'm talking about just covering the cost of making a film like this.
Right.
And again,
well, I think the beautiful point about this actually is, this is sort of a two-part riff, is that sometimes the films that don't really take off in the market end up being the big hits and changing the culture. This happens repeatedly. And I think everyone who's in the film business at a certain level wants to make a contribution to the arts. So there's a kind of double bottom line at play. The other part to my riff on this is that now is a really extraordinary time to be making independent films and documentaries, because there's so many places to get them released and so many more people to buy them and give them wider release. And of course, I'm alluding to streaming platforms and everything. And theatrical film had a great year last year as well. So it's a changing landscape, but I don't think there's ever been better news for doc filmmakers than the current climate, cultural climate, and the current appetite for quality independent film and nonfiction film.
And did I read? I think it was in the Times piece that your father worked at NBC. I'm curious about that and how that affected.
Oh yeah, well he worked. He had a lot of shows on NBC. He worked for a lot of major studios as a TV writer producer, starting in the golden age of television. I guess he began his career as a page at NBC in the 40s, before television. He was when NBC was a studio at Rockefeller Center, and then it quickly became TV in the late 40s, early 50s. And he became a major TV writer in the golden age of television. He wrote for shows that like Kraft, Armstrong Circle Theater, U.S. Steel Hour. These were the big shows at the time. And then had a really pretty remarkable career writing for shows that are classic, like The Virginian and Columbo on down. Those shows, the Columbo shows, which were mysteries, it was called the NBC Mystery Wheel, and it was in the 70s, where they ran, I alternated on a weekly basis a kind of 2-hour movie that was a very high quality production. Columbo is the most well-remembered. My father wrote for most of those shows, like McLeod, Macmillan and Wife. One was called Danachek, one was called Ellery Queen, which was a really wonderful show with Jim Hutton and David Wayne and John Hillerman. So that was how he spent the 70s mostly. And then he was the producer and writer of Murder, She Wrote in the 80s and 90s. So he had a long, successful TV career and was an influence on me. He was an influence on me that, I grew up in LA in that context, and it was interesting. And I appreciated it. I think the influence that my father had on me, almost more than the work he was doing at the time, was that he was one of those people who was encyclopedic about film. A lot of the kids who grew up in the Great Depression went to the movies all the time. So they almost saw every movie made in their lifetime. And he was one of those people, and he really, because he was a writer, he knew all the movie stars and the character actors, and he talked about them all the time. I took a great interest in this, and he was a huge influence on me through that. And the library at home had all these, all the Robert Benchley books and all the books about MGM, and all of that reading and what was available in the bookshelf at home was all because of him. So he was a big influence.
Well, now, having sort of discovered you for myself late in the game, it doesn't seem quite as surprising to me that you made such great films. And just as 6 degrees of separation. Or my father worked for NBC too in the 50s, just as a point of reference. But that's another story.
Where? New York?
In LA. Although he did go back and forth to New York, and at one point in time he produced the Oscars in the early 50s for NBC television. And a classic story, I remember coming home, this is in LA, one night, and there were like 6 Oscars on our mantelpiece that we had for a week, you know, while they were in rehearsals, when I guess security was a little easier in those days, that you could borrow the props, which were the Oscars. Tell us, Matt, what are you working on? What should we expect to see from you in the future?
Well, I did a series for Apple, which has not aired yet, and I'm not sure when it's going to air. They haven't really gotten started yet. So it's about architecture and design. And then I'm developing quite a few things, and I'm working on something that's deeply political right now. I'm actually not at liberty to say what it is for various reasons having to do with the negotiations with the producer, but it's a really political piece, and I'm very excited to get going on it.
Thank you so much for being a guest on our show. Your film, I can't recommend it enough. I'm so happy that I got a chance to see it in advance. I assume it's on the it's been submitted to the Academy for this year, because it's eligible, will be eligible.
Yes, it's been submitted, and yes, would be a this year thing. And thank you very much. It was really lovely to talk with you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.
It's an amazing thing, actually.
Diversity.
Vanity.
This is incredible.